China, Korea, Japan, and so forth, we could very easily find ourselves at war with China. And I don't think people are taking that seriously right now. And the Chinese are much better prepared for that than we are. They have built a lot of nuclear power plants. They built a lot of coal-fired plants. They have stockpiled a lot of energy. They're ready, if they have to fight us. They have built an enormous fleet. I don't think it's as good as ours by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a lot of it. And they have the capability to do what Iran has been doing to us. And I would say that capability would be on steroids. And that's the ability to reach out and essentially destroy an entire surface fleet from a distance. Not just the surface fleet, but any islands where we put anything. So I think we're courting disaster at this stage. And then the real question is, if China becomes involved, what will the Russians do? I suspect that they'll take the gloves off. They'll finish off things in Ukraine, and they'll turn with the Chinese against us. And I don't think they'll be the only ones. I don't think the Indians are going to sit there and do nothing, because India faces famine. India faces huge shortages. For these governments in Asia to do nothing and let us continue indefinitely is the pathway to suicide for them. Not only will their governments be replaced, but their populations are going to suffer. So I think it's worse than what you've said. It's not just Iran. It suddenly involves everyone else. And I think we got to go back to the region, and who else could become involved at this stage? Who else is on the line for all of this? Egypt, the largest Arab state in the region, and Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is probably the most powerful single military state in NATO. And there's nothing that we've seen hurled at us from Iran that the Turks don't also have. And no doubt in my mind, the Russians would certainly support and stand by the Turks and Egypt. So, this is running out of control. And people like Thiessen and others who are urging mass murder on the basis of arrogance and ignorance, they should be shouted down, because we don't need that. We don't want that. And that could be the end of us. You could see the complete collapse of American national power. We're already on the edge of serious trouble, but that would be the end of us.
Dan, you bring yourself in.
Sorry about that. It's one thing, Doug, if it's a Washington Post reporter, because he's the guy that just writes an article, right? He apparently President Trump listens to him, but it's even more concerning when there are guys who we know have President Trump's ear and that he listens to. Let me show you something that was in Axios, I think yesterday, the lower left-hand side here. Trump is also consulting with hawks outside the administration, including Washington Post columnist Mark Thiessen, as mentioned, but also retired Army General Jack Keane and Lindsey Graham. And let me show you what Jack Keane is saying. Here's what we should do.
We can't look at the regime through the prism of United States logic, values, and reason. We have to look at the regime in terms of who they really are. Hardliners are running the regime. What matters the most to them is to stay in power. They will ride this economic peril out. They don't care about the suffering of their people. Shutting electricity down, gas lines, and other economic indicators that the people are suffering. That does not move them. What does move them is the desire to stay in power. That is why we must go back to combat operations and maintain the blockade and use our intelligence services to undermine this regime so it does not just suffer economic collapse, but political collapse as well.
Now, we know what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to tell Trump. We don't even have to ask that question. But when you see guys like Thiessen saying what it was in that Washington Post article, you know what Lindsey Graham is saying too. And then here's Jack Keane, a 4-star general, retired straight out of casting, central casting, as Trump says a lot of times. When all of those voices are saying a version of what he said here, it's going to be pretty hard for him to resist that, don't you think?
Well, he tends to be influenced by the people that have access to him. Not everybody has access. And we have a lot of evidence, as we've seen recently from the article in the Atlantic, not that the Atlantic is the paragon of truthfulness and objectivity, but we did learn a great deal about Vice President Vance's personal thoughts and his concern that President Trump is not getting a full picture. We've had lots of people spin out fantasies about General Kane and how he is the adult in the room and all this kind of business. There's not much evidence for that. I think it's very dangerous. I don't disagree with you at all. And I think what's really worse about all of this is that these people are out of touch with what is happening inside Iran. You know, this is not sinking in. If you were to remove all of the people today that hold positions, responsible positions in the Iranian government, the people that you would get are much younger and are fully radicalized. You know, imagine if you had 20, 30 million people under the age of 40, all of whom want blood, who have decided that we can't be trusted, we don't want to negotiate, and are willing to fight to the bitter end and do whatever is required to be victorious. That's a terrible situation to be in. This is the last thing you want. This is back to this absurd idea of unconditional surrender. And that's effectively what Keane and Lindsey Graham and Thiessen and the rest of these neocons, all of whom are closely aligned to and in support of Mr. Netanyahu, want. They want unconditional surrender, just as Israel wants the total destruction of Iran. None of those things are in the interest of the American people. That's the problem. We're not interested in that. We don't want that. And then to compare this to the outbreak of World War II and the way people in the United States felt after the Japanese attacked us without warning on a Sunday morning at a time when Americans had very different sets of values from the ones we're accustomed to today is absurd. And this other thing about they don't share our values and concerns. They don't care about their population. I couldn't disagree more. I think they care very much about the population. My concern is that if you're successful, you kill everybody that you are currently dealing with. The people that will step into their shoes, they will fight to the end. They will go down as martyrs before they ever go down on their knees to Israel, let alone us.
Yeah, that's such a great point there, because that is their proclivity of a substantial portion of the population. And that's, we're seeing it play out. They're actually living that right now. Well, listen, Doug, in the amount of time we have left, I want to shift gears. It's something we haven't talked about in a while, but there are things happening there too, which have an impact on us here. In addition to all this stuff that we're talking about with the Iran war, there's still the Russia-Ukraine war going on. And kind of underneath the headlines, there's been a couple of important things that have happened I want to bring to your attention, or to our audience's attention, and get your view on. Number one is the European Union has, first of all, they've started another sanctions package on Russia. I think it's the 20th, and they're trying to get yet another 21st. I guess they just don't ever learn that hasn't changed anything, but they're going to keep trying. Then they also approved, because Viktor Orban was defeated, a $90 billion loan package to Ukraine, which Ursula von der Leyen here applauds.
In spring, we have said that we would deliver on the 90 billion loan for Ukraine one way or the other. Now we made good on this promise. We will disperse the first tranche of 45 billion euros for 2026, still this quarter. 1/3 for budgetary needs and 2/3 go to Ukraine's defense. And the first defense package will be on drones from Ukraine to Ukraine, worth some 6 billion euros. So our message is very clear. We will continue our support to the brave Ukrainian people and their armed forces.
So let me just ask you, Doug, from a financial perspective, already, because of our actions in the Persian Gulf here, everybody's oil prices is going up. Russia is potentially going to shut off what they had in Kazakhstan to make it even more problematic. Where are they going to get this money from?
Well, that's a good question. I'm sure they'll find a way to print some. I mean, that's all I can say. Whether or not it's going to be worth much is open to debate, especially if things go in the direction I think they're going to go here in the United States in the near future. And all you have to do is turn on Ray Dalio. Even Jamie Dimon finally is admitting that the bond market is in great risk right now of essentially catching fire, in the sense that you end up with yields that are just impossible to ever pay. And all these things are coming. But let's keep something in mind. Von der Leyen was the Secretary or Minister of Defense in Germany. And one of her great contributions was to tell the manufacturers of armored fighting vehicles that they had to adapt seating inside armored fighting vehicles. We're talking about Martyrs, we're talking about Pumas, we're talking about various kinds of equipment to accommodate pregnant German women so that they could ride into battle. The last thing I would want if I had a daughter and she were pregnant was to stick her in an armored fighting vehicle and send her into combat. But this is the level of craziness. And on top of that, von der Leyen is from the state of Germany that is being systematically deindustrialized, all because of the hate fest that she and others have helped to start against Russia. And unfortunately, Europe is a place with long memories, and people can be convinced of things that aren't true based on what happened 80, 85 years ago. Trying to tell someone that the Russians today have nothing to do with the Soviet troops that raped millions of women and killed millions of people on their way into Europe doesn't really register with a lot of people that don't understand the difference, don't understand how profoundly different Russia is today. So they are the Pied Pipers leading this entire population straight into hell. The Germans are going to have to wake up. Now, the good news is that the Alternative for Germany has now scored enormous success at the ballot box, and they won 28% of the vote. Now, people in the United States say, well, that's not much. No. You have to understand, when you look at the multiplicity of parties and the percentages that others have, the Alternative for Germany, by any normal standard, should have a role in governing Germany. And of course, von der Leyen and her friends are going to throw themselves onto in front of the onrushing locomotive to stop that if necessary, because, God forbid, the Alternative for Germany would throw out most of the migrants that have come into Germany since 2015 under Merkel. And that's something that is desperately needed, not just in Germany, but across Europe. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But if the Alternative for Germany is barred from any future government, I don't think Germany is going to last too much longer as a true republic. There will be uprisings in Germany. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that President Putin has exercised as much restraint as he has, because he would prefer that the Europeans conclude that he really is not the enemy. But the only way for that to happen is to remove these globalists, these anti-nationalists, these internationalists who want to destroy Europe from power. And that hasn't happened yet, but I think we're getting closer. That's the good news.
Well, yeah, we'll see how that goes. But let's look at the other half of that equation there with this $90 billion loan. Will that matter to Ukraine? Is that going to either sustain them so they can keep fighting and have some, I don't know, hope that somehow things can turn around in the future? Will this help it turn around? These drones she's talking about, will there be any chance that this could alter the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine?
No, but we have to reckon that 50% of this will end up in offshore accounts belonging to Zelensky and everybody else in his government, including many people in parliament, many of his senior officers and diplomats, all of whom have been stealing everything they could get their hands on. So that's the first thing. So what happens to the rest of it? The other 45 billion, will some of that trickle into the defense of the country? Yeah, probably. But is it really going to change anything? Well, they'll certainly get more assistance with drones, and drones have done a lot of damage. And that's the rub right now. The Ukrainians were able to launch a drone that they were helped to build, by the way. They do not build everything on their own. They don't create all the components on their own. Those components come from places like Great Britain and Germany and Italy and other countries, and they assemble them. And they were able to launch one roughly 1,000+ miles all the way to the northern part of the Caspian Sea. These kinds of things have infuriated the Russian population. So just as we've succeeded in radicalizing the Iranians and the youth of Iran, I think the Ukrainians don't realize the extent to which people in Russia really want Putin to extract more than just a pound of flesh. They want him to go forward and flatten Ukraine. I don't think Putin will do that right away. I think he wants to avoid that for the reasons I've already outlined, because there's a good chance that things will change in Western Europe in the near future. But he's a human being. And even though he is enjoying right now about 72 to 75% approval in the polls, much better than anybody in Western Europe, certainly much better than Donald Trump, he can't turn a deaf ear to the Russian population. And contrary to what people report here, no, they are not taking heavy casualties on the Russian side. And the Russians are in a position right now that they could seize Odessa very quickly. And I'm sure that in his councils of war, it's being pointed out to him that the quickest way to put an end to this disaster called Ukraine is to seize Odessa. That would cut it off. It would become landlocked, entirely dependent upon what comes to it through Poland. And I think that could happen. And that would be the first step in the final dissolution of Ukraine and the end of this war. Because after you seize Odessa, it's not very difficult to seize Kiev. And I think more and more Russians are coming to the conclusion that they're going to have to do that because this regime must be destroyed or there will be no peace, period, in Europe.
And that's certainly the view of many on the Russian side and the opposite view of those on the European side because they still have these fantasies that something is going to change. One of those that has a fantasy is the King of Britain, who was in the United States to give a speech before the U.S. Congress. Now, notice how the subject of Ukraine comes up in this big applause line in the middle of this sub. Watch this.
In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time, and the United Nations Security Council was united in the face of terror, we answered the call together, as our people have done so for more than a century, shoulder to shoulder, through 2 world wars, the Cold War, Afghanistan, and moments that have defined our shared security. Today, Mr. Speaker, that same unyielding resolve is needed for the defense of Ukraine and her most courageous people. It is needed in order to secure a truly just and lasting peace.
Truly just so he's still, I don't know if he's been listening to Keir Starmer because that's almost, that's his go-to statement, thus just and lasting peace. Are they disconnected from reality?
Absolutely, completely. And I think that we may, unless King Charles III leaves office in the near future, I think you could actually see the end of his dynasty. That's the sad part. I think Britain is now in need of dynastic change. Now, you said it sounded like Keir Starmer. I'm sure that's true. Keir Starmer's approval ratings are where? In the low 30s. I think the King's approval ratings are probably down there with him. I haven't looked at them lately. He's not taken seriously at all, whereas his mother was held in very high esteem, commanded tremendous respect. He does not. Now, hopefully, that could all change with the ascent of William to the throne. I don't know. But the bottom line is this is pure nonsense. But what's disturbing is that you saw all the usual suspects, Democrats and Republicans, all stand up and cheer on this stupidity. If they're not careful, they will ultimately succeed in getting what they want. And they seem to want a world war in which they want to fight everyone. And they may succeed because increasingly everyone wants to fight us. And by the way, with all due respect, Britain lost everything the last time it fought with us. It lost its national power. It lost its empire. Britain adds almost zero to our capabilities and our forces. And that's sad because that was not the case 80 years ago. But at this point, I wouldn't expect very much support from anybody if the kind of world war develops that I think is possible now. All of this hinges on some decisions by President Trump, just as whether or not the world went to war in 1914 really hinged on the decisions that were made by the Tsar of Russia. People will recall that the Tsar of Russia decided to mobilize his country in support of Serbia against Austria. That brought on the First World War. It wasn't necessary. Serbia was not a vital strategic interest to Russia, and the Russians could have talked directly with the Austrians and said, let's iron this out some other way, and made it very clear that under no circumstances did the Russians want to go to war with anybody. But he did the opposite because he at the time was surrounded by warmongering voices telling him that this was his path to greatness. We know now it was his path to destruction.
And death for him.
Yes. And Russia has only recently recovered, thanks to Putin, the man that everybody here wants to hate.
Indeed. And in fact, speaking of him, you mentioned a while ago the Ukraine side is getting better at its long-range drones. They've been striking some in the Ekaterinburg and several other places on the Black Sea coast that's hitting a lot of oil infrastructure, which is also starting to cause a lot of angst and anger inside of Russia. President Putin was actually forced to address it.
The Kyiv regime and its patrons have resorted to openly terrorist methods. The reasons are obvious, clear to everyone. The enemy is unable to stop the advance of our troops along the line of contact, and is losing territory every day. Every day. Hence the reliance on terror against both military personnel and civilians. They hope this will change something. It won't change anything, but the threats are there. As a reminder, in September, Russian citizens will elect deputies to the 9th State Duma, and large-scale campaigns will take place at the regional and local levels. Our priority is the safety of all election participants, candidates, election commission members and observers, and the tens of millions of people who will come to the polling stations. This primarily concerns the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts. Their residents will be electing federal-level deputies for the first time. And those who deny Donbass and Novorossiya their historical right to be part of their homeland, part of Russia, will, of course, try to hinder them.
So President Putin is saying not only are we not losing this war, we're going to deepen its connection already in these 4 oblasts into the Russian by allowing them to vote for Duma deputies for the first time. What do you make of that?
Well, these people are Russians. And he wants them to vote. He wants them to have a say in their future and their destiny. So I think that makes infinite sense. This was always from the very beginning about the treatment of Russians in Ukraine. Russians in Ukraine were reduced to second and third class citizenship. Their rights were violated. They were mistreated. They were being forced to, quote unquote, Ukrainianize or lose everything. And ultimately, that's why the Russians intervened. The war